As the women learned that they were supposed to have sexual privileges too, the domestic life of the town became more and more uneasy. A sexual separatism developed, with the men hanging out with the men at ball games, bird hunts, etc., and the women hanging out with the women at socials, bridge parties, and church activities. At times in the 40s, one might have got the impression that men and women alike were basically homosexual, but that was hardly the case. They were mutually frightened and inhibited, and suffered the emotional crises that people probably always suffer in periods of rapid transition. Men who were quite content with the 19th century were suddenly having to cope with women who had begun to take an interest in the 20th, and the coping wasn't simple. Then, in the 40s, came affluence, money. It was not the solution to what ailed them, but to men and women who had been poor all their lives, it offered a novel escape. Until the 40s, a great many Texans had been poor all their lives, and when they began to come into the money, it was natural that they should overrate it and expect the wrong things of it. They had imagined it would make them happier with one another, and they resented one another all the more when it didn't. Men made money, and women spent it. If one spent unstintingly, sexual poverty might be disguised. Spending might accomplish what fucking hadn't, especially if one went at the spending regularly and passionately. New houses, new cars, new clothes, wall-to-wall carpets and wall-to-wall bric-a-brac, gadgets and appliances, living room sets so uniformly ghastly one would have liked to burn the factory that made them. These were the order of the day in the 40s. The affluence reached far down into the middle class, where most of us were growing up, but perhaps its most interesting effects were to be observed not among the many, who were beginning to be reasonably prosperous, but among the comparative few who, in a few short years, got unreasonably rich. Most of these got rich in oil, or in businesses related to oil. You do not, in a few short years, get rich in cattle, and indeed, by this time it was already too late to get rich in cattle, no matter how many years you had. Before the 40s were over, we had with us those new bulwarks of southwestern masculinity, the millionaires, our world-famous nouveau riche. The world thought they were pretty funny, too, as they went about waving tokens of munificence and seeking desperately for the one great purchase that would establish their value in the eyes of all. The joke turned sour only recently when one of them got to be president. The era of the big spenders is now almost over here, and were it not that Mr. Johnson's behavior so continually calls it to mind, one would probably be inclined to treat the nouveau of the 40s and 50s rather sentimentally, as one treats a vanishing breed. Amid the bland Texas middle class, our vulgar rich can seem baroque and delightful, and indeed certain of them are delightful. As a class, however, they exhibit all the difficulties of the desperately confused, and they are dangerous in proportion to the amount of power they wield. They are frequently very able and very strong people, but I have yet to meet one whose abilities or whose strength counterbalance his insecurity. To reassure themselves, they brag and deal and buy, but the nerve of self-doubt remains always exposed, and the slightest pressure on it can bring them near to panic. They will do anything to win love, but they usually fail at it because their fear of opening themselves is stronger than their desire to be loved. Whenever possible, they open their wallets instead, and most of them end by subsuming all relationships into one, the relation of owner to owned. What cannot be owned, they destroy or ignore. Like LBJ, they are most of them pseudo-ranchers. In Texas, a ranch is the equivalent of a distinguished genealogy. It establishes one's connections with the past. Here, it is better to be a drugstore cowboy than no cowboy at all. Even the rich who don't take money lightly know that it is a lighter thing than land, and many a wealthy veteran of the oil patch has smoothed over his most basic doubts about his own value by buying a valuable piece of land and putting a few toy cattle on it. Of course, the separatism which one saw in the small town in the 40s had existed on the frontier, but then it was a separatism based upon work. Men's work took them away from women, and most of them were content with that arrangement. Anyone who has spent much time with cowboys will have observed that cowboys are a good deal more comfortable with one another than they ever are with their women. But I think it would be facile to assume from this that most cowboys are repressed homosexuals. Most cowboys are repressed heterosexuals. The tradition of the shy cowboy who is more comfortable with his horse or with his comrades than with his women is certainly not bogus. Cowboys express themselves most naturally, and indeed most beautifully, through their work. When horseback, they perform many extraordinarily difficult acts with ease and precision and grace. As the years pass, they form very deep bonds with the men and the horses they work with. But I think the reason these friendships, mateships, the Australians call them, are so relaxed and so lasting is because they are non-sexual and offer a relief from the sexual tensions of the household. The cowboy's work is at once his escape and his fulfillment, and what he often seeks to escape from is the mysterious female principle, a force at once frightening and attractive. The basic difficulty, I think, is that the cowboy lacks a style that would put him at ease with women and women at ease with him. His code has prepared him to think of women not as they are, not even as they were, but in terms of a vague 19th century idealization to which not even the most proper plainswoman could really conform. The discrepancy between what the cowboy expected of women and what they needed of him accounts for a lot of those long rides into the sunset, as the drifting cowboy drifts away not so much from what he might want as from what he is not sure how to get. Women shook his confidence because it was a confidence based on knowing how to behave in a man's world. And even the West isn't entirely a man's world anymore. Amid such tensions, my generation grew up. If we escaped permanent imprisonment in an obsolete sexual orientation, we escaped it by the skin of our teeth. And I think much of the credit for that escape must go to the movies, or at least to the media. Where else were we to get ideas about sex that had as much force as the ideas that were pressed on us at home and in church? In movies, we saw women kissing back, and realized early that the female might be responsive rather than reluctant. The images we saw may have left us slightly more visually oriented than is good, but they convinced us, at least, that sex was not necessarily something to be frightened of, and that was more than we could have learned at home. Though it seems incredible, We probably derived a more realistic view of women from the movies than we got from our home life and our social experience. This may, of course, be a chicken or the egg sort of argument, for no doubt movies were changing women as rapidly as they were changing our ideas about them. At any rate, they gave us images and examples to set against the repressive dicta we all inherited. But as I said earlier, I do not want to write about us as adults here. Our encounters with and part in the sexual revolution of the 50s and 60s, our proclivities for bohemianism, adultery, divorce, and other once undreamt of novelties, these must await another occasion. It is time now to have a look at the landscape. It may lack the piquancy of our sexual customs, but as many a traveler can attest, there is a great deal of it to be looked at. A look at the lost frontier. Number 5. Readers of Howard's End will recall that Margaret Schlegel, at the age of 29, longed to see life steadily and see it whole. When I was 29, I had the same ambition in regard to Texas, or at least I feigned such an ambition in order to weasel a little traveling money out of a magazine. There are times when one just feels like driving. By that time I had written 3 novels about Texas without bothering to travel much in it, and it seemed to me I ought to get out and store up a few new perceptions. I was willing to perceive anything that lay reasonably close to the road. Early one warm, foggy November morning I left my home in Houston and headed south toward Mexico. I had decided to drive first to Brownsville, in the far southeastern tip of the state. Then I would turn north and drive for days and days until I eventually came to Texline in the far northwestern corner. Such a route would expose me to almost 1,500 miles of Texas, enough perhaps to give me some inkling of what the state looked like. As I left Houston, the lights from the many motels colored the fog orange and green, like the fogs in cheap science fiction movies. One sometimes wonders if Bowie and Travis and the rest would have fought so hard for this land if they had known how many ugly motels and shopping centers would eventually stand on it. When I crossed the Brazos River, all the motels were behind, and the fog beneath the bridge was white as milk. Richmond, Wharton, El Campo, Edna, Victoria, all were still asleep. The only signs of life, an occasional produce man unloading crates of cabbages in front of a grocery store. The country was dim and lovely, as it always is at dawn or dusk, when the smells and colors have their full substance and have not been neutralized by the dust, the flatness, and the heat. Around 5 a.m. I turned on the radio and listened to a tired announcer out of Shreveport doggedly plug a hillbilly album called the Teardrop Special. The songs he played were almost as tired as he was, most of them third-rate renditions of old hillbilly staples by Hank Williams, Webb Pierce, and Kitty Wells. Hillbilly is a music of estrangement, the estrangement of country people who have moved to the city and not found the city good. Most of the songs are utterly banal, yet something of the emotional rawness of such people's lives comes through. Nostalgia is raised almost to the level of a passion, nostalgia for the home place, some happy rural seat where the familiar connections still hold, where there are no cheatin' hearts, honky-tonk angels, or one-sided loves. After the music came the market reports, and by this time the lights had begun to come on in the kitchens of farmhouses along the road. In these parts, listening to the stock market means finding out what yearlings are bringing in Fort Worth, and how many shoats there are in Kansas City. In the houses just off the road, the farmers and ranchers were buttoning their shirts and listening pessimistically, while their wives put biscuits in the oven. 5:30 in the morning is an awful time to be getting bad news, but those who endure it to the end are rewarded with a snappy chicken feed commercial and 6 or 8 bars of the Yellow Rose of Texas just to tie things off. I breakfasted at Refugio, a small town on the gray coastal pastures, 15 miles or so inland from Copano Bay. The glass of water that came with breakfast had more flavor than the food. It was almost as bad as the water one gets in Fort Stockton, a desert community some 900 miles to the west. To take my mind off the water, I looked at the morning paper and discovered that the President was entertaining various members of his cabinet at the LBJ. 1 or 2 of the guests looked more tormented than entertained, particularly Secretary Freeman, who was frantically attempting to drive a cow someplace. A cattleman at the oilcloth table next to mine was considering that picture with grim delight, a consolation, perhaps, for the price of cattle. South of Refugio, I crossed the Aransas River. 6 large turkey buzzards were sitting in a tree by the bridge, waiting patiently for something to get run over. I had an insane urge to cable their whereabouts to Paramount in case they were finding themselves again at a loss for buzzards. The run to Kingsville was otherwise uneventful, and the next 70 miles even more so, for I was crossing the King Ranch. There were no towns and no filling stations along that stretch, though now and then one sighted one of the little King Ranch communities to the west of the road. Usually they consist of a gas pump, a score or so of green and white houses, and a 1-story stone schoolhouse. The Gulf was not many miles away, and the constant push of the sea wind had twisted the live oak trees so that their branches all pointed inland. In the Panhandle, I think of Charles Goodnight, but in South Texas I think of Captain Richard King, who left his mark on the area so indelibly that even motorists on a national highway sometimes feel like trespassers for 70 miles. Happily, by 8 o'clock I had got beyond the big ranch and into what is called the Magic Valley. A helicopter came buzzing over a row of skinny palm trees, and a border patrolman peered down at the road suspiciously, as if he expected the bar ditches to be swarming with wetbacks. The first of the valley towns is called Raymondville. I stopped and had a piece of apricot pie in a place called the Texas Moon Cafe. There was a Clabber Girl baking powder sign nailed to the front wall, a relic of 40s advertising seldom seen nowadays. The waitress was a plain-faced woman who had her hair put up in an old-fashioned hairnet. There was only one other customer, an old man in clean khakis who sat at the counter staring at a half-glass of Lone Star beer as a chess player might stare at a chessboard. When I stood up to pay, I asked the waitress if there was anything special in Raymondville that a person ought to see. "I tell you, what I'd like to see is the city limit sign going out," she said. "You either got to be poor or ignorant to stay in a place like this." "The hell you say?" the old man said, carefully pouring a little more beer from bottle to glass. "You ain't lived here long enough to know what you're talking about. I guess you'd rather go up to Houston and get killed on them freeways." He contemplated his glass with an offended air. "I guess an old widder woman like me ain't going to be too happy anywhere," the waitress replied, somewhat intimidated. "Anyhow, I wouldn't trade Upshur County for this whole valley down here. You ever been through Gladewater?" She was asking me, but the old man didn't notice. "No, and I ain't in no hurry to go," he said. I had been through Gladewater that spring and said I thought it was lovely country. "Oh, yeah, it's right pretty in the spring," she said, staring at the counter a moment with a look full of memory. Then she caught herself and gave me my change. "I hope that pie wasn't too old," she said. "We don't sell much apricot." "That pie was cooked sometime this fall," the old man said, tilting his bottle carefully so that the last drops of beer would drain into the glass. "I don't remember it being here last summer." In Raymondville, I began to see the vivid roadside grocery stores that are characteristic of the valley. The counters are heaped with cabbages, cucumbers, green peppers, yellow squash, beans and onions and melons, all of which create a great sense of abundance. At Harlingen, I turned east and took a brief side trip to the hamlet of Rio Hondo, hoping to find the filling station where Nelson Algren once spent so much time shelling black-eyed peas. I had in mind asking the Texas Institute of Letters to make it a literary shrine. I located several likely candidates, but positive identification was difficult, and I soon gave up and drove on down the lower valley through the city of Brownsville and across the Rio Grande into Matamoros. A border is always a temptation. American suburbia had managed to push its way only about a mile into Mexico. The apartment buildings on the broad avenue near the river were homogeneous and modern, but as one approached the center of town, the streets grew narrower and the smell of cooking grew stronger. Near the central square, I encountered a small but extremely passionate brass band made up mostly of teenagers. They were playing military music with demonic fervor. I parked and angled away on foot, but the band attached itself to me and pursued me closely all through downtown Matamoros. Now and then I would lose it for a few minutes, but despite the noise of 7 trumpets, it always managed to sneak up on me again. After a time, I dodged into a little grocery store called the Miscelinea Ruiz, where I drank a Coke and read Mexican comic books while the band marched around outside. When I emerged, a taxi was waiting for me. The driver, a pleasant and ingenious man, promised to find all sorts of dirtiness for me, and proved his ingenuity at once by managing to drive 3 miles while transporting me to a grocery store 2 blocks from our starting point. To the rear of the store, amid huge, fragrant stalks of bananas, I met a nervous little grocer who took me back in a corner behind a pile of cabbages and produced a cigar box full of very low-class erotica. The most amusing item in the collection was a piece called The Mishandled Housemaid. The story was set in post-war Paris, but the volume was delightfully and incongruously illustrated with photogravures of Grecian lads and ladies, complexly entangled in the Parthenon. I paid the banana man for his trouble, but declined purchase. My taxi driver, a little offended, asked me if I wanted to go out to Boys Town. 600 girls, he said, all clean. One does not go far in Matamoros without beginning to appreciate the dust-cutting effects of pavement. The whole of Boys Town and the pastures of scraggly mesquite surrounding it were coated in a thick layer of white dust. My driver took me to a place called the Cabaret 2X, where he assured me the girls were beautiful and absolutely immaculate. It was noon and extremely hot. The bar was empty except for a somnolent bartender and some clean tile tables. I emphasized that I was only in the market for carta blanca, but the point was ignored. For the first few minutes, however, the Cabaret 2X was one of the most beautifully quiet places I had ever seen. The bar was clean and cool and opened onto a patio where one could see the hot sun beating down on the dusty bushes. I was reminded of Faulkner's remark in the Paris Review about how convenient a job in a whorehouse could be for a writer. I had found the ideal place to write a short story, and was a little chagrined not to have one in mind. Unfortunately, despite my protests, the bartender insisted on waking up one of the girls. Her name was Carmilla, and when she staggered in, my taxi driver rattled his glass in embarrassment. She was neither beautiful nor immaculate, and only love or the omnivorous horniness of adolescence could have transformed her into a palatable sexual object. I apologized for having been the innocent cause of her being awakened. She made a few derogatory remarks and went back to bed. The bar settled back into its lovely quiet, and I had another carta blanca, hoping a short story would occur to me. But something, probably Texas, was pressing too hard on my consciousness, and in a few more minutes I left and crossed back over the Rio Grande. When I cleared customs, a simple process on that border, it was 1:30 p.m. and 89 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade of the customs shed. All Texas lay before me, literally. I picked up Highway 281 right where it begins and drove west through La Paloma, Los Indios, Santa Maria. Teams of braceros were at work in the green cabbage fields. I drove all the way up the valley to Rio Grande City, a dusty little town that has been the scene of several celebrated border battles, some of them quite recent. Then I turned back to McAllen and drove north through the orchard country. The valley's charm is only fully evident in the evening, when dusk touches the orchards and the white sky becomes a deep liquid blue. As the day waned, I passed Captain King's ranch again and saw scattered bunches of Santa Gertrudis cattle, their red coats shining in the late sunlight. I stopped for the night in Alice. All afternoon I had been in that part of the state where life is cheapest, particularly Mexican life. No part of the state has a bloodier history, or indeed a bloodier potential. Should the laborers of the valley ever acquire a militant leader, one smart enough to avoid arrest or assassination, the border country might again be as dangerous as it was a century ago. In Alice, things were peaceful, if not quiet. The teenagers seemed to be using the car horns to exchange messages in code. I dropped in at a hillbilly dance hall, but it was virtually empty. In the Mexican part of town, crowds of kids were about, drinking orange soda pop in front of tiny corner grocery stores. When I was a very small boy, my father took me with him on a cattle-buying trip to a ranch in the all-but impenetrable brush country near Alice. I could not understand how the vaqueros could find cattle in such a tangle of mesquite. My fancy motel was a far cry from the old Boomer's Hotel we had stayed in on that trip, a hostelry where the bedbugs were many times more numerous than the guests. At one point on that trip it had been necessary for my father to leave me in the car, out in the middle of a vast brushy pasture, while he went off on horseback with the owner of the ranch. While I waited apprehensively for his return, 4 greasy and mirthful Mexican cowboys filtered out of the brush, as if by magic, and loped up to the car. They were as delighted to see me as I was appalled to see them. They dismounted and crowded around the car, talking in rapid Spanish. At that time I knew little enough English, and only one poor phrase of Tex-Mex, no sabe. I told them no sabe several times while they tried to tempt me out of the car with offers of ropes, spurs, and food. Unfortunately, all they had in their saddlebags were a few mountain oysters, calves' testicles, that had been lightly scorched in a branding fire several days before. I was not tempted, and when the novelty of finding me wore off, the vaqueros mounted up and vanished silently into the brush. Already the doors of the many small bars were propped open to the soft air. I walked by the San Antonio River a while, and had breakfast at a cafe by the waterside, only a few blocks from the Alamo. The green water flowed quietly past and on toward the gray, salty gulf, where I had been but the morning before. When I finished eating, I walked by the Alamo and over to the little square where sometimes the friendly old bums of O. Henry still gather on winter mornings to take the sun. We have never really captured San Antonio, we Texans. Somehow the Spanish have managed to hold it. We have attacked with freeways and motels, shopping centers, and now that H-bomb of boosterism, Hemisphere, but happily the victory still eludes us. San Antonio has kept an ambience that all the rest of our cities lack. I threaded my way out, still on 281, and was soon in, hallelujah, the hill country, homeland of our president. On the radio, the Reverend Carl McIntyre and his colleague Amen Charlie were dishing out a familiar version of the gospel, half Jeremiad, half appeal for funds. Old-style preachin' on the blood is going out now, both on the radio and in the churches. Most small-towners prefer a mild Protestantism, a sort of theological librium. It is mostly old-age pensioners who keep the Reverend McIntyre on the air, and he, in turn, helps strengthen them in their conviction that America is teetering on the edge of the pit. In Johnson City, I stopped and searched for cafes, hoping I might find a cowboy named Chuck Ritchie, who had moved there from my hometown. Not long ago, in a national magazine, Chuck had come forth with the interesting theory that intelligent men are likely to have big ears, the way some intelligent horses do. The bigger the ears, presumably the smarter the man, a standard that would make President Johnson a universal genius. Unfortunately, Chuck was not to be found, and after a bit of aimless exploration in Johnson City, I turned toward Austin. Had I felt more diligent, I might have made an attempt to see the LBJ Ranch. But besides being of limited diligence, I had been by the ranch a few months before, and the parts that were visible from the road were no more verdant than any other scrub country pasture. There are a great many pseudo-ranches in Texas, and they don't vary enough to justify much investigation. Some just have more telephones than others. Physically, Austin is a pleasant town. Dusk found me in a drive-in on Guadalupe Street. I had been on my way out, but the Marquis had promised an all-new height in fright and might, and I decided to rest a while and take in Hercules and the Haunted World. It starred Reg Park, surely one of the funniest and least cerebral of the neo-muscle men. As Hercules, he proved somewhat too stolid, so while he descended into the netherworld, I got out and had a look at the refreshment lounge, itself a netherworld of a sort. Most of the teenagers in the drive-in had abandoned their cars and were packed into a special television room, which the management had thoughtfully provided for those who couldn't stand movies. The Dick Van Dyke Show was on, and the kids were annoyed because the screams of Hercules' imperiled heroine kept drowning it out. On the TV, a girl in an off-the-shoulder black dress was singing, "Way down yonder in Louisiana, just about a mile from Texarkana, in them old cotton fields back home." Her cleavage was impressive, though probably if she had attempted to pick cotton in that gown it would have been even more so. The lounge had a large plate-glass window through which one could see some 50 feet of heroine. She also was décolletée, and was about to be sacrificed to a vampire. The kids were not interested in either girl, but in their own reflections, which flickered onto the plate glass whenever the screen outside momentarily darkened. So many levels of sexual posturing were visible at once that it veritably swamped the senses. For a moment I felt myself the ultimate spectator, an audience within an audience within an audience. Then it occurred to me how eerie it would be if someone were watching me, and I got my car and left. It was a clear, warm night, with still a tinge of afterglow beyond the Austin hills. At Lampasas I picked up 281 again and followed it north through Evant, Hamilton, Hyco, Stephenville. The moon was high and white over the Brazos Valley. It made me think of the Texas Moon Cafe and of the widow woman and her argumentative customer, their good times mostly gone. Soon I crossed the Brazos, its channels silvered by the moon. As always, crossing it there, I looked down, hoping to see John Graves pass underneath me in his canoe, for the Brazos is his river, and one expects him there. In Mineral Wells I parked beside the towering empty Baker Hotel and slept a while in the car. I awoke an hour before dawn and had the highway to Jacksboro all to myself. There a lone filling station man was hosing down his pavement. The radio stations in Fort Worth had not yet come awake. Some 20 miles beyond Jacksboro I entered my home country. In the darkness to the west, a mile and a half off the road, lay the old McMurtry homestead, the land my grandparents had settled on in the 1880s. I topped a ridge, and in the clear 5:30 darkness could see the lights of my hometown 15 miles away. Through my college years, topping that ridge had always given me a great sense of being home. But time had diminished the emotion, and I had begun to suspect that home was less a place than an empty page. Still, it was good to see that the lights were still in their place on the horizon. In some ways, the town seems more remote and isolated now than when I lived there, and in time I imagine the remoteness and isolation of the small towns of the West will constitute their most positive appeal. I breakfasted with my parents and was on my way again by 8 o'clock. The breeze was coming down from the Rockies rather than up from the Gulf, and was consequently much cooler. In order to avoid Wichita Falls, I took a shortcut to the northwest. Lubbock, Amarillo, and Wichita Falls are the three principal cities of the Texas Plain, cities that I find uniformly graceless and unattractive. In summer they are dry and hot, in winter cold, dusty, and wind-swept. The population is rigidly conformist on the surface and seethes underneath with imperfectly suppressed malice. As I was driving through an oil town called Electra, I passed a senior citizen's home and saw an old man in a red mackinaw sitting in a wheelchair on the south side of the building, in the lee of the wind. His name was Jesse Brewer, and since he had been my first friend in the world, I swerved off the road and stopped. During the war, when most of the younger men were gone, Jesse had cowboyed for my father for a while. I have always suspected that his real job was to keep me out of danger, or at least out of the way. When I walked up and said hello, he was chewing tobacco and looking out across the brown rolling country to the southwest. "How you doing, Larry?" he said, no whit surprised to see me. Then, looking cautiously around to see who might be watching, he spat tobacco juice on the roots of a domesticated prickly pear that was growing by the wall. The look around was a habit formed in ranch houses where women were apt to take unkindly to men who chewed. Jesse was in his 90s and had sunk a little farther into his mackinaw in the 5 years since I had last seen him. His spirits, however, were excellent. He at once proceeded to ask me all the questions that are standard in the cattle country. How were my father's cattle? Was there any grass? Where was I living? When I told him Houston, he made a grimace of commiseration. "Hard to breathe down there, ain't it?" he said, convinced, as most plainsmen are, that any place south of Waco must be a malarial swamp. As we were chatting, a nurse came out, decreed he had had enough sun, and briskly wheeled him in for a morning of television. For a man who had followed the cow, it seemed a dull end. We waved, and I drove on, and did not see Jesse alive again. At Esteline, I crossed the Red River and knew I was on the plains. In Clarendon, a town teeming with McMurtrys, I stopped for a succession of lunches with my uncles and aunts. Had I cared to draw on cousins, I could have prolonged the feeding for several days, but I was coming into the home stretch and wanted to drive. High above, the thunderheads were blowing south. I passed through Claude, and to my surprise, the water tower still said Thalia. Between Amarillo and Dumas, I saw a small herd of antelope grazing on the brown plains, obviously the pets of some rancher with a little grass to spare. At Dumas, I turned due west toward Dalhart. There were some 45 minutes of sun left, and almost 80 miles between me and the New Mexico line. I was tired and had begun to feel a little flat. The drive was almost over, and I had not seen anything that would lead me to any startling new assessment of Texas. The long, sloping fall sunlight fell beautifully on the green winter wheat fields east of Dalhart. In the gullies and breaks of the rougher country, I saw seedling mesquite spreading up out of the draws in irregular lines. The persistent mesquite. When my father was a boy, there were none in Archer County, almost 400 miles to the south. By the time my son is old, there will probably be mesquite on the slopes of Pike's Peak. Perhaps that was going to be the only discovery of the trip, mesquite in Hartley County. The drive merely pointed up two things that I had already known. The brush thrives, and the small towns wither, their sap draining into the cities year after year. In my own hometown, population 2,000, there was an old man named Taylor who lived in a mansion just across a Sudan field from our house. His fortune was made, and he spent his time reading. When I went to bed at night, I could see the light in his library window, and when I awoke in the morning it would often still be burning. At 4 in the afternoon, he drove down the hill in his Packard and got his mail. In the junk piles behind his house were piles of book catalogues, mostly English. He was, I suppose, the village intellectual, a figure of yesteryear, defunct now like Buffalo Bill. His successors have all gone to the city, the brainy, the imaginative, the beautiful, even the energetic. None of them can find much reason for staying in the towns. When I passed through Dalhart, the sun was not more than 10 minutes above the wheat fields. I had 40 miles to go into a clear panhandle sunset. When I drove through Tex Line and out to the marker at the border, the sun had been down 20 minutes, and afterglow circled the entire horizon with pink and rose. The sky, which had seemed clear, really held a thin, almost invisible glaze of cloud, and streamers of afterglow reddened the clouds as far east as one could see. I got out and stood by the marker a minute in the biting north wind. 1,073 miles from the Rio Grande Bridge in Brownsville. It was only 35 degrees, a warm fall evening for the plains. Clayton, New Mexico, was only 6 miles up the road. For the sake of symmetry, I should have gone across and spent an hour, but I was not tempted. There is no place in Clayton as pleasant as the Cabaret 2X. What was hard was not going on to Denver. You can't see the Rockies from Tex Line, but you can sense them, and the wind brought me visions of Colorado, of couples in Denver walking in the cold, clean evening air in the park below the gold-domed Capitol. But my destination lay in the other direction, and I turned my back on Denver and drove slowly into Tex Line, rather dreading the 40-mile return trip to Dalhart. As soon as I got rolling, the dread fell away. The plains were lovely as they darkened, and I cannot but love the plains, nor cross them without the sense that I am crossing my own past. I curved back down to Dalhart. Through the wind the trail herders bucked, and the last few miles, with the lights twinkling ahead of me on the plain, were among the best of the trip. It only remained to perform some acte symbolistique to give the drive coherence, tie the present to the past. I stopped at a cafe in Dalhart and ordered a chicken fried steak. Only a rank degenerate would drive 1,500 miles across Texas without eating a chicken fried steak. The cafe was full of boys in football jackets, and the jukebox was playing an odious number called "Billy Broke My Heart in Walgreens, and I Cried All the Way to Sears." The waitress was a thin, sad-eyed woman with hands that looked like she had used them to twist barbed wire all her life. She set the steak in front of me and went wearily back to the counter to get a bottle of ketchup. The meat looked like a piece of old wood that had had perhaps one coat of white paint in the 30s, and then had had that sanded off by 30 years of panhandle sandstorms. "Here," the waitress said, setting the ketchup bottle down. "I hope that steak's done enough. There ain't nothing like steak when you're hungry, is there, son?" "No, ma'am, there ain't," I said. That night I drove on to Dodge City. In 2 days I had come from the Nueces to the Arkansas, a distance the trail drivers would have been pressed to cover in as many months. I would have liked, while I was at it, to drive the state east to west, from Texarkana to El Paso. But I had neither the time nor the money, and anyway, the prospect of driving back from El Paso was too depressing. Seeing the state whole requires one, of course, to take some account of those dark portions of it which lie east of Dallas. I have had, admittedly, few opportunities to observe East Texans in their native habitat, and since those of them who stray from beneath the pines soon learn to disguise their origins, I have had to glean what I can about the people there from the works of William Humphrey and William Goyen. I did, however, have one singularly good opportunity for direct observation, when in 1962 I attended the 27th Old Fiddlers Reunion, an event held annually in Athens, Texas. In order that the region known as East Texas not be entirely slighted in these pages, I should like in the following section to record the impressions I gathered that day. The Old Soldier's Joy. Number 6. Athens is a medium-sized East Texas county seat town, located some 70 miles southeast of Dallas. It lies between the Neches and the Trinity, in country that is not too heavily wooded. In May, when the Old Fiddlers Reunion is held, the country is green and clean-smelling, with a little pine in the smell. I arrived around 9 in the morning, early enough that the air was still cool. At the red light by the southeast corner of the courthouse square, I stuck my head out of the car window, expecting to hear the screech of country fiddles. Instead, I heard a vastly amplified, city-billy voice singing, "Don't let the stars get in your eyes, don't let the moon break your heart," a sound so loud and so quintessentially down-home that I was momentarily paralyzed with emotion, or something, and had to be honked into a parking place. On the east side of the courthouse there was a big pine lumber platform, upon which the fiddling and string band contests would be held. The platform was occupied just then by a Mr. Red Rogers and his band, a group that seemed committed exclusively to the music of Bob Wills. I had not driven all the way from Fort Worth to hear such a decadent strain of hillbilly, so I hurried off to look for old fiddlers. When the substantial barrier of the courthouse was between me and Mr. Rogers' music, I felt better about things and stopped to survey the scene. A small, quietly lyrical group was gathered nearby, and on the extreme periphery of it stood the first old fiddler I was to talk with, Mr. Clarence McGraw of West Los Angeles, California. The group proper consisted of 2 fiddlers, one of them Mr. McGraw's brother, 1 guitar player, 1 policeman, and 2 totally committed listeners. The fiddlers and the guitar player were playing Cripple Creek, and the listeners gave the music their gravest attention. Mr. Clarence was fiddling too, but not Cripple Creek. He was off to one side, fiddling angrily to himself. He looked exceptionally clean and vigorous for a man his age, or any age. His gray khakis were brand clean and strongly starched. He kept one eye on his brother, who had a curious way of tucking his fiddle under his solar plexus rather than under his chin. I had a notebook in my hand, and when he noticed it, he immediately began to fiddle in my direction. "You're a reporter for the paper, ain't you?" he asked, and then quickly turned aside and scratched out a few disgusted measures to himself. Before I had time to deny it, he was on the attack. "What I'd like to know is how a feller goes about getting an account of this here fiddlin'," he said. "This here's about got me whupped." "How so?" I asked. "I come here last year and fiddled," he said. "By God, when I got home, I wrote 3 separate letters back asking them to send me an account of how she all come out. I never got nothing. Not a damn fare thee well. You ask me, this here's the ass o' nowhere." About that time the group finished Cripple Creek and quietly began to break up. The policeman made mild protests. "Hey," he said, "y'all play that Under the Double Eagle. Y'all ain't played that yet." But the group demurred and went their way. The McGraw brothers got into an inconclusive argument over who would use which fiddle bow in the contests to come. Mr. Clarence was bitterly self-deprecatory and said it made no difference. He could fiddle about as well without a bow. His brother, a quiet man, seemed inclined to let him try. When the McGraws left, I decided to look for the man in charge of the contests so as to know what was happening when. A farmer was sitting a few feet away on the courthouse steps, resting himself beneath the long morning shadow of the courthouse and the smaller but more portable shadow of an old felt hat that in its day had soaked up a lot of head sweat and dust and rose hair oil. When I asked him about the contests, he was thrown slightly off balance. "Why, they're liable to start any time," he said sadly. "Pretty soon, I expect. Old Bob Hall's the man to ask about that. He'll have the papers on it. Just go up and ask him, first time you catch a chance. Bob won't care." I thanked him and said I would, but I didn't. Though I found the man he was talking about, I never could quite catch the chance. By 10 o'clock there were swarms of fiddlers about, and not all of them old. Indeed, the most popular fiddler present that day was a local youngster named Texas Shorty, a fiddle-playing arriviste if ever there was one. He was in his mid-20s, short and stocky, and dressed in the artificial pearl button and near gabardine of a minor hillbilly entertainer, the sort who, ages ago, would have drawn only the faintest crackle of applause from Horace Height's applause meter. I listened to him a while, and his fiddling seemed as passionless and repetitive as the tinkle from a moderately well-made music box. While he fiddled, a female relative circulated through the crowd, selling glossy pictures of him, and letting it be known that he would autograph them. I would have thought a career of Saturday night shit-kicking at the Big D Jamboree would have been the summit of Shorty's ambition, but apparently I am no judge of fiddling. I found out later that he had just returned from a tour of England, a tour sponsored by the State Department. The news cooled me a bit on the new frontier, but before the day was over I was forced to admit that Shorty did have something. What he had was tenacity. All day long he fiddled steadily, now here, now there, but always fiddling. Sally Gooden was all he knew on earth and all he needed to know. When I left at 9 that night, he was up on the big platform, sawing sturdily away. After the McGraw group broke up, I wandered back around to the platform side of the courthouse, looking at the faces in the crowd. There was a curious group of teenage pseudo-thugs. They wore identical cheap straw hats and had them pulled so far down over their eyes that they had to walk leaning backwards in order to see. And there was the youngest and least confident sailor I've ever seen. He had on a white uniform and stood around all day wishing he could go home and take it off before someone challenged him to a fight. The country people were there too. Old-timers sat on the courthouse steps chewing tobacco. Now and then one would rise and hobble painfully over to some bush, spit his tobacco juice into it, and hobble back. Infants lay on spread-out quilts under the trees, sucking their blue plastic bottles while their grandmothers or little sisters sat by and shooed the flies. Around 11 o'clock, Mr. Rogers and his fellows ceased trying to scale the heights of Bob Wills, and the old fiddlers' contest started. Happily, it was soon over. Only about 20 old men were entered, and each fiddled only 2 short numbers. By noon they had all put their fiddles away and retired to shade trees or the homes of relatives. I was glad. The contest was like Paradise Lost. No one could have wished it longer. As they stepped up, one by one, to fiddle, the old men reminded me of the superannuated ministers one sees in the congregations of Southern churches. On special Sundays like Christmas and Easter, the old brother may be asked as a matter of courtesy to stand up and say a prayer or lead a benediction. Now and then one will get up and do the job briskly and sit down, but more often the old preacher will rise shakily, tremble, work his jaws a little, quaver out a beginning, perhaps forget what comes next, cry a little, desperately improvise a line or two, and, to the infinite relief of all, ashamedly slump down, more than ever aware that he has become too old to cut the mustard. So it was with the old fiddlers. 1 or 2 sawed their way vigorously through Turkey in the Straw or the Arkansas Traveler, but most didn't. Most quavered.